Now let's shift our focus to something threatening to kill us all: artificial intelligence. Yes, the AI tools that are going viral also have the potential to cause our extinction, almost exactly like in the Terminator movies. And we aren't the ones saying this. It's the people who created the tools. There's a letter released by AI developers and experts yesterday. It says, and I quote, "Mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war." And so they are comparing AI to pandemics and nuclear war. Let's look at who signed it. Top of the list are Jeffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, two of the three people considered the godfathers of artificial intelligence. Hinton quit Google earlier this month. He said it was so that he could warn people about the dangers of AI. He recently spoke about how AI could turn on humans.
If you want to go to Europe, you create the sub-goal of get to the airport, and then you solve that sub-goal. And for any complicated goal, you want to create sub-goals. And it turns out here's a very good sub-goal for almost anything you want to do. Get more control. If you get more control, it makes it easier to achieve other things. So once these things are able to create sub-goals, them being very smart, I think they will quickly realize that if they got more control, they could realize their goals much more easily. And once they want to get control, things start looking bad for people. So if you're a skilled manipulator, and these things will be extremely skilled manipulators because they'll have learned from all the manipulations people ever did. So they'll be much better than a person at manipulating us. They'll be able to manipulate us into doing whatever they want. It'll be like you manipulating a 2-year-old. So they don't need to pull levers or press buttons. The idea of air gapping them and everything will be okay isn't going to work.
Then there are the CEOs of the leading AI firms: Google, DeepMind, Anthropic, and OpenAI. Yes, even OpenAI, the firm behind ChatGPT, which arguably started the AI arms race. Even Sam Altman believes that there is a risk of extinction from AI.
If this technology goes wrong, it can go quite wrong. And we want to be vocal about that. We want to work with the government to prevent that from happening.
He's asking governments to get involved. He wants to work with them to stop the AI apocalypse. Altman has flip-flopped on the issue so far. Earlier, he said he didn't want too much regulation. He even threatened to pull out of Europe over upcoming AI regulation there. But then he backtracked. Now, with this signing of the extinction letter, it seems he's completely sure about the dangers of AI. Altman is traveling around the globe, meeting world leaders to discuss AI. He will meet European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen tomorrow. He's also expected to visit India next month. Speaking of India, New Delhi is also looking at the threat posed by AI. It's expected to lay out guardrails for the technology in the upcoming Digital India Act. The law is set to become public next week, but the focus is disinformation, not annihilation. It seems that the world has not grasped the scale of the danger. Politicians seem more focused on how AI can peddle disinformation, how it can cause problems in upcoming elections, which is also valid. It's already started in the US with AI-generated deepfake videos doing the rounds. But they're missing the forest for the trees. That's just one of the problems that AI brings. We think the end of the human race is the bigger issue here. Politicians need to focus on the big picture before it's too late to stop the rise of the machines. Now let's turn our attention to North Korea. The country had planned to launch a satellite by June 11. Why? To monitor US military activities. And it tried doing so, but failed. North Korea's first space satellite crashed into the sea. But while the satellite failed to do its job, it succeeded in one thing: creating panic. The launch sparked a false alarm in the South Korean capital of Seoul. Japan also issued a warning to its residents of Okinawa. There were air raid sirens blaring, emergency messages passing around. There was chaos and confusion as people tried to save their lives, only to be told 20 minutes later that there had been an error. Our next report tells you more about it.
What you just heard were wailing air raid sirens. In South Korea's Seoul, and Japan's Okinawa. This was followed by mobile phone alerts. They called for evacuations, which is rare. All this happened on Wednesday morning. People awoke to the confusion. Residents were rattled. Reports say people were frantically running for cover. Some grabbed their children and hid. Others started making calls to their loved ones. Many were frantically dialing the emergency numbers. Some even went online to check what had happened, but internet was slow.
I was a little confused by the alert message this morning.
I thought it was an earthquake, but when I looked, it was a missile.
This panic and pandemonium went on for about 20 minutes, after which both Japan and South Korean governments clarified. There was no missile attack. In fact, it was a failed satellite launch by North Korea. Pyongyang had launched its first space satellite, only it was a failure, crashing into the West Sea of Korea, but it was successful in sparking a false alarm in South Korea and Japan, because both the countries were unsure about what had just happened, and they jumped to conclusions.
Today, an object that appears to be a ballistic missile was launched by North Korea.
However, both South Korea and Japan were completely wrong, and now they have apologized.
I apologize for causing confusion over Seoul City's emergency alert message on North Korea's space launch vehicle this morning. This emergency message could be a working level official's overreaction, but it was not a mistake. Our principle is to respond in a manner that can be seen as excessive, and there can be no compromise on safety.
Residents of both these countries live under constant threat, thanks to their neighbor, North Korea. North and South Korea are still technically at war, even though 7 decades have passed since the Korean War ended in an armistice. And now Pyongyang under Kim Jong-un is amping up its aggression, especially as it plans to expand its nuclear arsenal to apply pressure on both Washington and Seoul. But that being said, this latest move by North Korea has angered South Korea and Japan. Their citizens are upset too, not with Pyongyang, but their own governments.
How do they ensure that they can trust in their local authorities? And I feel like every time in this case, if we're talking about North Korea, every time that North Korea fires a missile of some sort, and there's possibility that it may either fly over Hokkaido or be landing within Japan's EEZ.
While people are justifiably angry over this false alarm, the threat is very real, because North Korea is clearly on a war path, and the war clouds over Japan and South Korea are looming large. And one day, they may actually rain fire.
Russia is under attack again. Yesterday, Moscow was struck by drones. Today, a refinery has been targeted. This one in Russia's Krasnodar region. Pictures showed a fire engulfing the refinery. It was later put out by the local authorities. Casualties? None so far. But what caused this fire? Russia is blaming Ukraine. They say Kyiv launched a drone strike on the refinery. And that's just one attack. A separate one was reported in the Belgorod region. That one killed at least one Russian citizen. Again, Ukraine has been blamed. But how credible are these allegations? Kyiv has been silent so far. Russia has repeatedly blamed them for attacks inside Russian territory. But every time Kyiv has denied it, perhaps it's Ukraine's strategy to avoid escalation. Or maybe Russia is bluffing. Either way, the frequency of these attacks are growing. We've seen drones over Moscow, railway sabotages, bridges being blown up, and multiple refineries being targeted. The Russian president has reacted to these incidents. He says there are terror attacks.
As you know, the Kyiv regime has chosen a different path. The path of attempts to intimidate Russia, Russian citizens, and attacks on residential buildings. This is, of course, a clear sign of terrorist activities. First, I want to say that the Moscow air defense system worked in the regular way, although there are things for us to work on.
There are many ways to look at this. From Ukraine's perspective, these attacks give them more leverage. It puts fear in the mind of Russian citizens, which means indirect pressure on Moscow. From Russia's perspective, it's the perfect excuse. They can just say, look, Ukraine is attacking us, so we are escalating. But which of these is true? I'm afraid it's impossible to know because, as they say, truth is the first casualty of war. For the moment, let's assume Kyiv is behind these attacks. Do they have Western blessings for it? That's the tricky part. The US and Britain seem to have different policies. The White House says, don't attack Russia. The UK says, by all means. Listen to this.
Look, we do not support attacks inside of Russia. That's it. Period. I mean, I cannot be any more clear than what I just stated. We do not support attacks inside of Russia. Period.
It does also have the right to project force beyond its borders to undermine Russia's ability to project force into Ukraine itself. So legitimate military targets beyond its own border are part of Ukraine's self-defense.
So where does that leave Ukraine? In a bit of a pickle. President Zelensky is trying out a very delicate balancing act. Publicly, he says this is a defensive war, a war that has been forced upon Ukraine. But privately, he wants more aggressive tactics. That's what leaked documents from the Pentagon show. 3 audacious missions stand out. Zelensky wanted to occupy Russian border villages. He wanted to strike a pipeline carrying Russian oil to Hungary. And he wanted long-range missiles to hit Russian targets. NATO has given him long-range missiles, but that supply came on one condition, that those missiles will be used for defense and not offense. So far, the promise has been kept. Long-range missiles have not been used to hit Russian targets. Instead, we have seen unconventional methods, like Russian militias aligned to Ukraine or low-cost drones. There's logic to using these methods. You see, Russia's air defenses are designed to deter missiles, but low-flying drones, not so much. Listen in to this expert.
Russian air defenses, particularly around Moscow, are oriented on a different kind of threat. They are oriented on missiles, ballistic missiles, regional missiles, aircraft, bombers, but not short-range drones, which might be flying very low over the ground, for example. The Russians have been focused on the United States and what it could do, and not on what one of its neighbors might do with these relatively short-range drones.
That could be one reason. The idea of these attacks isn't to overpower Russia. That's virtually impossible. The idea is to put pressure on Putin, to make Russian citizens feel insecure and hence raise their voice. But is it working? Well, yes and no. The attacks have caught the Wagner Group's attention. Their chief is blaming the Russian Defense Ministry once again in colorful language. Listen in.
The fact that they fly to Rubliovka, to your home, the hell with it, let your houses burn. And what do ordinary people do when drones with explosives crash into their windows? And therefore, as a citizen, I'm deeply indignant.
So there has been an impact, but not like mass paranoia. We're not seeing Russian citizens flooding bomb shelters, and that's the downside. Russia could use these attacks to step up the fighting. We are already seeing evidence of that. The city of Kyiv was attacked thrice in 24 hours this week. So in conclusion, let me say this. The attacks inside Russia represent a new phase of this war. This time, Ukraine is making the moves and Russia is on the receiving end. But how long will Putin let that slide? We'll find out soon enough. We talked about the Ukraine war. It has led to the displacement of millions. Around 8 million Ukrainians have crossed over to Europe. No hassles, no delays. They were welcomed with open arms. Now compare that to Afghan refugees. Tens of thousands of them have reached the EU borders. They are awaiting resettlement. But I'm afraid it's an endless wait. Let me tell you what an international charity has found. Around 270,000 Afghans need permanent protection, meaning resettlement. Guess how many actually got it in 2022? Just 271. We did the math. That's 0.1% of the Afghans who needed resettlement. So much for Europe's open arms. Only 271 out of 270,000 Afghans have been resettled. And the rest? Well, they are living in camps on Greek islands. Quick side note, Greece is often called the gateway to Europe. It's the assembly point for most refugees, but their camps are horrible. This charity's report describes them as prison-like. It also accuses the EU of staggering neglect. In 2021, Germany set up a scheme to resettle 1,000 Afghans every month. And how many did they? 0 under that scheme. Italy has taken in half of what they promised, and some countries did not even bother. Austria refused to take in more Afghan refugees. So did Serbia and Poland. They simply shut the door. So thousands of Afghans were trapped in Greek camps. Their living conditions are bad, but their mental health is worse. Around 90% of them reported anxiety. 86% reported symptoms of depression. The obvious question is, why isn't the EU taking them in? It's not resources for sure. We just told you how Europe welcomed 8 million Ukrainians. What is 270,000 compared to that? So the only answer is racism. Europe doesn't have a problem with white European refugees, but it has a problem with Afghans. Take Poland, for example. They've done great work for Ukrainians. Around 1.3 million refugees are still living there. But let me tell you how that same Poland treated Afghans. In 2021, they trapped 32 Afghans at their border with Belarus. They refused to let them apply for asylum. Just think about it. Red carpet for 1.3 million Ukrainians, iron fence for 32 Afghans. If this isn't racism, what is? The fact is, Europe has a responsibility to these people. They had no problems marching in to Afghanistan with NATO, nor with occupying the country for 2 decades. But when it comes to refugees, they have no time or resources. So what's the solution? The EU has been asked to scale up the process. They have also given a target. Resettle at least 42,500 Afghans in the next 5 years. Ideally, it shouldn't take that long, but knowing the EU, even that target is impossible.
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.